let's come to one of the what should I say leading sectors, leading in terms of leading indicators of sectors, which is the automobile. If you see in both for upper end of the economy, where we have passenger vehicles, and then we have two-wheelers, which is more driven by the rural, and then we have commercial vehicle, which is more at an overall economic industrial activity level. And therefore growth in automobile sector in some ways indicates overall economy how it is doing well. Automobile sector was doing very well till very recently, I would say till about 6-9 months back. But now we are facing challenge. The while earlier there were wait list for many cars are running into 8 months, 9 months. Now we have stocks which are lying with the dealers, and they're not able to sell them. Again, do you think it was a, what should I say, a pent up demand which was kind of really post pandemic, which was leading us through, and now again we are back to very slow demand in the automobile, because that again is indicative of the overall demand situation in the country.
Indeed, I mean, pent-up demand has played a key role in the post-COVID phase, that, or rather, the stupendous growth that we saw on the automobile side. And of course, like any sector, this also has to have some moderation, which will be hitting at some point in time. The key once again lies in terms of how to spur up this sector through other means, in the sense that, say, once again, if the government's focus is likely to be on the electric vehicles and like that, how to ensure that the incentives, they keep on flowing. Even on the two-wheeler side, how to ensure that the demand gets generated. I mean, today one of the key observations that all of us have is in terms of, like, say, most of the e-commerce deliveries are happening through the e-vehicles, right? So that aspect is also catching up. So how to ensure that these kind of interventions can lead to a positive impact? I mean, that's the government will have to keep on exploring.
Right. The other is, let's say, come back to the manufacturing sector. Now, manufacturing sector, giving credit to the government, was a focus area for last few years. Production linked incentive, the PLI schemes, Atmanirbhar Bharat, Make in India. There were a lot of at least slogans which the government came out with, and obviously there were incentives which kind of. And then there was an expectation in the opportunity of China plus one, that the India will finally have a manufacturing boom. And I mean, if you see almost all the global economies, including China or Southeast Asia, Korea, all of them have really driven through the manufacturing boom. Do you see right now, are we, I mean, at least to my mind, it doesn't seem that we have really caught that bandwagon yet. And can we expect something from the budget in this time to really enable the government, or rather the overall economy, to focus a bit more on the manufacturing side?
I believe so. I mean, the government will indeed be receiving this kind of submissions from the various industry bodies and the sectors, and taking some decisions on that. But having said that, I think it's also an interesting feature where the government will have to keep a very close eye on, is the fact that, see, once again, how China and US shall be behaving. And US also, in our conversation, you also mentioned rightly that potentially we could be witnessing a lot of focus coming on the industrial sector in US, right? So how to revive that, ensure greater employment over there, and in the process force the other countries to pick up the US goods, right? China already is a manufacturing powerhouse. With this kind of two dominant economies driving the course for the future, how are we going to pick up the threads from this and ensure that we have our rightful place? So the canvassing for us remains in the form of, say, if we are targeting US, in that case, if in a way we are going to have a transactional relationship with US on the manufacturing side, allow more of their goods to come in our country, in that case, we'll have to select the sectors where potentially we should be having an advantage in terms of exporting to the US. Coming to China, once again, Chinese economy, because it is having its own issues, there could be a possibility, and which is already happening, where China keeps on dumping the capital also outside, in the sense that, say, they will be putting their capital outside, make those countries use that to buy the Chinese goods, right? Which is already happening, right? And in the process create some kind of a trap for those countries also eventually in the future, right? With this kind of I would say maze before us, how are we going to navigate? It becomes a headache, right? For all the policymakers, is never an easy task. But I think the thought process is indeed there in the government, that to pick up the white spaces for us to operate and keep on spurring on this. That would be the crucial for reviving this thing, because there would always be a limit to which we could be driving the things through an internal consumption demand. Although consumption demand constitutes almost like 60 odd percent.
Yeah. So I think you're making a very valid point, Mehul. And what I'm understanding is your point is that we should not be blatantly increasing our manufacturing capacity, because then our capital will be deployed there. And if we are not able to effectively compete on cost or quality with China, or maybe going forward US, then it could be a double whammy, because then our capital is blocked and it's not giving us return. So therefore, even though we want the manufacturing to grow and it should have a higher proportion in the overall economy, but we should be very careful considering China's whole dumping possibility, and US's more protectionist kind of this thing. And therefore we should be more careful in investing our capital, I think.
Of course, and there are always an economic, you can say, trade-off in terms of, like, say, wherever our competitive advantages and disadvantages are, how much more protective could we afford to be, right, without impacting the other sectors, right? As also the global linkages in terms of the WTO and those kind of agreements which will be there. It's a path that we'll have to very cautiously keep on navigating and figure out in terms of where we can strike the right kind of transactional deals and benefit out of that.
But how do you think, I mean, on the protectionism, I mean, the whole world is now, waiting with the bated breath about how Donald Trump will, he said that he will levy 20% straightforward and then maybe 60% on China. These are very, very obnoxious numbers. Free trade cannot exist with these kind of tariffs. Do you really think we will be at the beginning of a trade war? Because if, say, US levies it, I mean, other countries will not be far behind. It's always a tit for tat. And in that case, the whole trade, the whole efficiencies which come because of trade kind of vanish. How do you see this? I mean, do you think it's a matter for a grave concern right now, or do you think the sense will prevail and maybe Trump is only wielding a stick, and then he will kind of be more rational in his thinking?
My take is that sanity always prevails, right? Whatever be the posturing is likely always in terms of ensuring to gain the maximum out of any transaction, right?
Correct.
So it's more from that angle. You put so many things on the table that the counterparty would always be compelled in terms of ensuring that at least now, if 15 things have been asked, at least we'll have to relent on 5, right? So, but if you ask for 5, then perhaps you end up with 1. It's that kind of a strategy which is at play. Nobody can afford to take their eyes away from the core economic realities. Imposing tariffs, it's not easy in that sense for a sustained period. More than anything else, it impacts your own economy also.
Exactly. And that is what is really surprising, or rather is ironical, is that the US has come out of an inflation challenge. So it took them almost 2 to 3 years, with high interest rates and everyone. And now if they again levy tariffs, it will most immediately the impact will be on inflation, because suddenly your imported goods will become more expensive, which ultimately the consumer has to pay, and which will lead to inflation that again countries like India will have to import that inflation. So in a way that could be very, very debilitating.
Exactly. So that in effect, I mean, this is like going to the Cold War era, wherein everybody would be worrying about an impending Cold War, which can, I mean, the World War which could be happening. But is the deterrent of the impact which could be devastating for all parties concerned, right? That force them to the negotiating table and figure out some deals, which is exactly how the economic wars also they end up. Beyond a point, it's nobody can sustain that thing. Sanity prevails.
Correct. Okay, now let's come to consumption. I think that is where, to my mind, the biggest concern on the Indian side is, because infrastructure spend, as we said, maybe because of the elections it was not there for a quarter or two, and it will come back. It's basically, and we have full confidence in government's ability to do that. But consumption is a bit more spread out, and you really can't force people to consume. And especially if you see, the urban consumption has been more impacted in the last 1 or 2 quarters, as we've seen. So how do you see on the consumption side the Indian economy, and could the government in this current budget take some actions which will help them to improve the consumption at an overall level?
I believe that the government will have to strike on the sentiments of the people in a positive way, to a significant extent. And as we witnessed the pronouncements coming from the government side also, about how over the period of time high inflation had impacted the actual money, the disposable income of the households, right?
Correct.
That clearly gets reflected on the consumption side.
Correct.
Perhaps the government's thinking could be in terms of
Mm.
reviving those sentiments by giving some benefits to the consumers.
Mm.
We already have had the impact in terms of the corporate sector getting the benefit with the corporate tax rate
Correct.
having been reduced,
Reduction.
moderated
Yes.
to a significant extent, right?
Correct.
Now potentially it could be turned in terms of the individual consumers and
Mm.
how that could be impacting on the rural side and especially on the urban side,
Mm.
especially the middle class. So we could be witnessing some interventions from the government to revive the sentiments.
Mm.
Whether or not it can lead to any meaningful aspects, but more than that, I think if the sentiments they get addressed, then
Right.
the animal spirits can get revived in terms of consuming more. If there is a confidence in terms of
Yeah.
how the future looks like, people would spend more.
And maybe with that, the corporates would look at more investments in
Exactly.
manufacturing.
Yeah.
So it
So
could
it's
be
a
a
yeah.
virtuous cycle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Mehul, this brings us to the last topic of discussion for us. And you just mentioned about how maybe the government will kind of, simulate some growth by
Yeah.
giving some tax cuts. At least the sentiments will improve. But that brings us to the fiscal deficit issue.
Yes.
That how the fiscal deficit, how seriously the government will take the fiscal deficit targets, and there is an expectation that they will keep bringing it down to 4% or so.
Yeah.
So, do you think the government this year may bite the bullet and decide on keeping away the fiscal targets for a year or two and just focus on the growth, or maybe they will be able to pull a rabbit and out of their this thing and manage to have good fiscal deficit but also stimulate growth?
I think so there are, as far as the current year is concerned, the government has had the benefit in terms of robust tax collections on the GST side, and coupled with not too much of even the public capex happened because of the successive state and the central Lok Sabha elections, right? So from that angle, more or less, the 4.9% fiscal deficit for the year, the government should be in a position to
Or maybe
achieve
overachieve.
overachieve in the
Yes.
yeah. So that is a distinct possibility. I think the pride which the government takes in terms of ensuring that the fiscal discipline is going to remain the hallmark of their administration. They are not going to relent on that. The key focus would be to somehow spur the private sector capex and ensure the growth is also happening, right? And through that, the interventions on some tax benefits on the consumption side, leading to a private sector capex, and ensuring that the public sector capex, which the government had always been focusing upon, sustains.
Yeah.
But under any circumstances, I do believe that government will not go on any kind of fiscal profligacy, even if it is for a couple of years. They would like to maintain that thing and keep on differentiating us vis-a-vis many other economies on this.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mehul. It was a pleasure to have this conversation
Absolutely,
with
my
you.
pleasure as well.
And thanks. And please stay connected for our future podcast at CareEdge. Thank you.